This is Lecture 14, Learning and Memory, and it covers Chapter 14, excluding Section 5. Reminders and announcements. Homework 14 is due as usual Sunday the 21st at 11 p.m. Next week's lecture, Lecture 15, is going to be our last lecture of the course. There will be a week before final exams that you'll have off. You won't have any homework or lecture during that week, and then exam 3 will post on Monday the 6th. Which is finals week, and will be due that Friday on the 10th at 11 p.m. If needed, I can make this flexible. I'm very happy to. I can post the exam the week before. I can also leave the exam open through the weekend following finals week, but I need to know as soon as possible if anyone would like this to happen. So if you would like an extension on the exam either way, posting early or being open a little bit later, please shoot me an email in the next week or two. Your recommended reading this week is a New York Times article on hearing visual stimuli. So for example, in this GIF, there's no visual input, but some people hear like a thudding sound when the little jump roping electrical tower hits the ground. And this is a pretty robust finding. Many people experience this. And experience it across a variety of stimuli. And so if that's interesting to you, you can read a little bit about possible mechanisms for this in this article.
So Section 1, Connecting Learning and Memory. We're going to be talking about neuroplasticity a lot, which, if you remember from earlier sections, is the ability of the brain to change in its anatomy and or its functionality. This is typically in response to experience or injury. And learning is, of course, a form of neuroplasticity. Learning has corresponding changes in the brain. Learning is the acquisition of knowledge or skills from experience that results in relatively permanent changes in behavior. And memory is the ability to recall or recognize previous experience. Behavioral changes result in brain changes, as I just mentioned. For example, things such as psychotherapy. There's indication that people who undergo psychotherapy and improve whatever emotional or cognitive issues they were dealing with, their brain changes along with that. This includes increases in prefrontal activity, increased connections between brain areas, etc. All right, so types of learning. I'll go over this kind of quickly. I imagine you learned this in Psych 100. It's just kind of a refresh. So there's the classical conditioning, which is also known as Pavlovian conditioning. This was made famous by Ivan Pavlov, who trained dogs to salivate to the sound of the bell. By accompanying that bell with meat powder, so that eventually, even in the absence of meat powder, dogs would salivate when they heard a bell. So classical conditioning is repeated pairings of an unconditioned stimulus, such as food, like that meat powder, with a conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, and that results in a conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus. So when the bell rings, the dog salivates in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. Fear conditioning is a form of classical conditioning, and this is when a person or an animal is conditioned to fear a stimulus that would otherwise not be fear-inducing. So there's a famous example that was unethical by all standards these days, but you could do it back in maybe it was the 70s, where a little baby named Little Albert was trained to fear a white rat by associating that rat with a loud sound. So they would show him the white rat and then hit like cymbals behind him, and that would scare him. And eventually they did this repeatedly, and he came to associate the rat with the loud noise, and eventually in the absence of the loud noise, he would still be afraid of white rats. Kind of as a side note, he would generalize that fear. He was also afraid of bunnies and afraid of dogs due to this experiment. And fear conditioning is mediated by the amygdala more than other types of conditioning. The amygdala is highly associated with fear and anxiety and extreme emotions. There's also eye blink conditioning, which is one way that we use to study, it's a more ethical way to study classical conditioning. And this is when a person is conditioned to blink when they hear a tone, because the tone is paired with a puff of air to the eye, so they come to expect the puff of air with the tone, and they blink later just when they hear the tone. And this is actually mediated by the cerebellum because it's motor learning. Blinking the eye is a motor function, and it's one that is mediated by the cerebellum. And then there's operant conditioning, which is another major form of conditioning that you probably also heard of in Psych 100. This comes from learned associations between actions and consequences, so it's more conscious than classical conditioning. I'm not going to go over all of the differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning, but you can follow this link to a nice little YouTube video if you like. Operant conditioning is it's more complex and therefore it's less localized in the brain compared to classical conditioning. The areas involved depend on the specific task that's being conditioned. However, the reward circuit is involved, especially in reinforcement. So there's, if you look at this graph to the right, there's reinforcement is what you do to increase the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. So negative reinforcement, you take something averse away, and positive reinforcement, you introduce something that they like. So, for example, if you gave a treat to a dog for shaking your hand, then that would be positive reinforcement. If you if the dog really hates wearing his jacket and you took it off when he shook your hand, that would be negative reinforcement, something's taken away. And then punishment, negative punishment is when you take away something that they want, and positive punishment is when you introduce a stimulus that they don't like in order to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. Two main types of long-term human memory are implicit and explicit memory. Implicit is also known as non-declarative memory. Sometimes it's unconscious memory. You can't explicitly retrieve that information. It includes things like riding a bike, conditioned responses, and priming. It includes procedural memory is a specific type of implicit memory, which is knowing how to do a task without having conscious awareness. So the classic example is riding a bike. If you know how to ride a bike, you can't actually describe to somebody how you ride a bike, like what you do to ride a bike, but you know how to do it. And it also includes priming, which is using one stimulus to sensitize the nervous system to a later presentation of the same or similar stimuli. That's kind of a complex definition for just saying it's kind of prepping your brain for a given response. So there's something called semantic priming, where you prime someone to come up with a certain word. In a semantic priming task, like the one to the right here underneath the bike rider, if you give someone a list of words to remember, you can prime them to help them remember words. So for example, if all these words, garage, nail, violin, and diesel, were in the word list, the word car would prime someone to remember the word garage. Anvil would less strongly, but somewhat, prime someone to remember nail. However, unrelated words like buckler would not prime someone to remember violin, and cross would not prime someone to remember the word diesel. Okay, these are non-words, so there are non-words included in here. An example of such a lesion study is patient HM, who since his death a few years ago we know is named Henry Molaison, and he had profound deficits in explicit memory. So he had surgery to remove his medial temporal lobe due to seizures, terrible seizures that were affecting his ability to function. So this included portions of the hippocampi, the parohippocampal cortices, endorhinal cortices, and both the amygdala. And he suffered from difficulty, or actually complete deficits in forming explicit memory. So other cognitive abilities were retained. He had some implicit memory. He could still remember how to do many skills. And he had memories from before his surgery, but he wasn't able to form new memories. He was profoundly unable to form memories. He would repeatedly ask the name of somebody that he had been meeting every day for weeks. He, if given lunch, would eat lunch over and over again. And he was kind of the first indication that explicit memory relies on the medial temporal lobe, and that there's this distinction between explicit and implicit memory. So he was probably the most well-known case study within cognitive neuroscience, and was a lifelong research subject who really contributed a lot to the field. Patient JK had a deficit in implicit memory. This individual had Parkinsonian symptoms, which resulted, Parkinson's disease, which resulted in damage to the basal ganglia. It was, he showed deficits in implicit memory, but retained explicit memories. So this indicated that implicit memory relies on the basal ganglia. And again, more evidence that these two systems, implicit and explicit memory, are different. So the brain regions associated with explicit memory, the more specific brain regions, medial temporal regions, as well as the frontal cortices and related areas. This includes the hippocampus, amygdala, parahippocampal cortex, pararhinal cortex, and the endorhinal cortex. That all have specific memories of their own, specific functions of their own. The endorhinal cortex has kind of received more attention lately. It appears to have integrative memory functions, so integrating lots of different memories, and may be the first place that cells die in Alzheimer's disease. So it may be one place that we can target in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. The hippocampus is highly implicated in spatial memory. So visual spatial memory is the use of visual information to encode and recall the location of an object in space. In London taxi drivers, there's this great study where they looked at London taxi drivers and found larger posterior regions of the hippocampus in London taxi drivers who have a extremely good visual spatial memory. London's a huge city, obviously. Within the hippocampus, there are specialized spatial cells that have different functions. And it's a little bit complex, but the three main types of cells are place cells, which are active when an animal is in a given place in the world, regardless of their orientation. So this little rat guy up at the top, the different colors indicate different place cells that fire when the rat is in different areas of this maze that she has run through a number of times. And so this first area that she's in, there are specific place cells that fire when she's at the beginning, these cells that are denoted by this purple color. And then for this other specific place in the maze, there's a different group of place cells that fire for that place. There are also head direction cells that fire when an animal's head is in a specific direction. So regardless of where they are in space, if their head is pointed to the right, then a specific group of cells are firing. And then finally, grid cells fire according to an internal grid. So again, regardless of where you are, of what environment you're in, your brain kind of creates a grid of that environment, and cells fire according to where you are in that grid that you've created in your head. There are reciprocal connections for explicit memory between the neocortex and the entorhinal cortex. The frontal lobe is highly associated with short-term memory. So in addition to the mediotemporal areas, sensory areas also, these all project to the frontal lobe. As you know, frontal lobe has more of like a controlling or executive functioning. So frontal areas are associated with updating and maintaining memories, selecting, manipulating, and monitoring the information from memory, selection of sub-goals that are related to memory usage, so how to use memory to implement goals. The prefrontal cortex is associated with working memory, which is temporarily held information that's used to guide behavior such as decision making and planning. So working memory typically is information that's just being used very briefly. Consolidation is a term for memory that means encoding a memory for storage, or as your book describes it, stabilizing a memory trace after learning. This essentially just means encoding a memory. So when we say if you say I'm going to try to remember this word, what you mean is you're trying to consolidate that word into your explicit memory. We don't know a ton about consolidation of memories. More research is needed. But there's one theory called the distributed reinstatement theory, that information is learned and then stored kind of temporarily, mostly in the hippocampus. Then this information is rehearsed to strengthen connections between the hippocampus and other areas of the brain, and more long-term memory is stored in non-hippocampal areas of the brain. If you remember the sleep lecture and what we learned about sleep, it's possible that sleep has a role in consolidating the memories and moving it from the hippocampus to non-hippocampal areas. When memories are brought back into our conscious awareness, they connect with new information, they're changed, and then they're reconsolidated. So every time you remember something, you're adding connections to current situations, and you might also be, based on your context or based on other things that you're thinking about, you're changing that memory. And so this kind of speaks to the instability of memory and untrustworthiness of memory. In general, we all tend to trust our memory more than we should. Human memory is unfortunately rather fallible. So for example, in legal cases, when they use eyewitness testimony, there are a lot of psychologists who believe that eyewitness testimony should not be as weighty as it is in a legal system, based on information we know about how eyewitness testimony can be rather easily manipulated, even if an individual doesn't mean to. They can kind of convince themselves that they remember something that they didn't. Autobiographical memories are memories about our own lives, and these have a unique neural signature as well. The frontal lobes are involved, as well as the temporal and maybe parietal lobes. There was an individual, patient Casey, who had frontal lobe injuries and couldn't remember any personal memories of life events. So he remembered facts about himself, facts about the school that he attended. He remembered the information he had learned in high school, but he couldn't remember any events that involved him occurring at his high school. There are individuals who have highly superior autobiographical memory, who can recall almost every event in their lives beginning in mid-childhood, and this is associated with increased gray matter in temporal and parietal regions and increased white matter projections between frontal and temporal regions. Perfect memory sounds great, but it can actually be a burden to some people who experience it. It can part of the reason that we forget things is because some information is not needed in our lives, and so remembering too much can be certainly a huge benefit in certain situations, but can also have a negative impact on people. Neural circuits for implicit memories include the basal ganglia, which takes input from the neocortex, This then projects to the thalamus and the premotor cortex, and it's associated with dopamine projections through the basal ganglia. And these neural substrates of implicit memories explain why individuals with basal ganglia damage, such as individuals with Parkinson's, have impairments in implicit memory. Emotional memories have a distinct neural circuits as well. Emotional memories don't really fit into the implicit-explicit dichotomy. They could be one or the other. They could be both. It's not entirely clear. They at least tend to have some features of their own. So the amygdala is highly involved in emotion memory, of course. It's connected to the basal ganglia and the medial temporal cortex. So it's connected to areas involved in both implicit and explicit memories. The amygdala is also connected to the hypothalamus and brainstem structures and the neocortex. So kind of a lot of the major regions of the brain are connected to the amygdala and also involved in emotional memory. Moving on to section 4, the structural basis of brain plasticity. I'm going to go over the section pretty briefly and in broad strokes. I don't want you to worry too much about details in this section unless it's interesting to you personally, because I know it's pretty dense and there's a lot of information in this section, in this lecture already. So neural circuits allow for consolidation and storage of memories, and learning is mediated by changes in these neural synapses within these circuits. Long-term potentiation is a term that we use to describe long-lasting increases in synaptic effectiveness after the synapses have been used a lot, after high frequency of stimulation. So, for example, if a synapse is often used, then it's strengthened. There are more receptors on the postsynaptic left. There's more receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Long-term depression is long-lasting decrease in synaptic effectiveness after low frequency of stimulation. So if a synapse is not used often, it's weakened. We sum up that principle by saying use it or lose it. So if a synapse is not often used, if a brain function is not often used, then it's weakened to make room for other synapses. Changes in synapses are reflected in changes in dendritic and axonal structure, mostly dendrites. Dendrites are highly plastic and changeable. We used to believe, I want to say like 30 years ago, that adult brains don't create new neurons, and we are increasingly finding out that that's not true. Adult hippocampus cells, as neurons can be created in the adult hippocampus. For example, in that taxi driver study, they followed those taxi drivers for I think like 4 years, and found that over the course of training, taxi drivers had increases in hippocampal volume. As well, new neurons are found in frontal regions, temporal, neocortex, and the olfactory bulb. Changes in the brain are, of course, dependent on experience. So an enriched experience leads to increased neural growth and synaptic connections. We saw some of that in the developmental chapter, where kids who grew up in the Romanian orphanages had less brain growth than kids who grew up in more enriched environments where people were paying attention to them, their social interaction, etc. Increased complexity and expertise in a skill is associated with more neurons and connections in that region that's dedicated to that skill. And higher education is associated with more dendritic branching in Wernicke's area. So higher education, presumably you're using your language skills more, or developing them in a highly skilled manner. And so we're seeing language areas of the brain having more dendritic branching, more associations in those areas. Just a note, I'm skipping material from the book for the rest of the section, so I'm skipping around in the section a lot to kind of try to keep the information that you have to deal with to a minimum, because I know there's a lot of information in these two chapters. So the general principles of brain plasticity: behavioral changes reflect brain changes. All nervous systems are plastic in the same general way, so plasticity in the human brain looks like plasticity in the rat brain or the monkey brain. Plastic changes depend on age. Young brains are very plastic. Older brains are definitely less plastic. Prenatal events can affect later potential for plasticity, so adverse prenatal events, as well as exposure to neurotoxins, can affect the ability of the brain to be plastic later on. Plasticity differs among brain regions, so we talked about how the hippocampus has a high potential for plasticity, whereas other areas of the brain are less likely to change. Experience-dependent changes interact with one another, so different areas of the brain, depending on what's in one area of the brain, changes may be different depending on what's happening in another area of the brain. And finally, plasticity can be a benefit or a hindrance to humans, and we can learn bad behaviors, and it can be hard to change those learned bad behaviors. So this is chapter 15, Thinking in the Brain, and I've excluded I've excluded 3 of the sections, 4, 5, and 6, for the sake of brevity. I think a lot of the materials that were in those sections we did touch on in previous sections of the book, but by all means read those sections if you are interested. So the nature of thoughts. This chapter, I think, ended up being a bit of a catch-all, just covering a lot of topics that didn't necessarily fit in other sections. So it's going to jump around a little bit, but there's definitely some interesting material. Psychological constructs. A construct in psychology is idea that a mental ability is an actual entity. So the idea that like memory is actually a thing, or language or emotion. Before we knew about brain systems, we had all these kind of folk psychology terms for things. And the more we move into brain systems, some of those constructs in psychology are being reinforced by brain areas that are dedicated to those, brain areas and systems that are dedicated to those functions, whereas other psychological constructs we're not finding to be explicitly represented in the brain as well. We don't always have consistent definitions of psychology constructs, which makes psychobiology really complicated, because if we can't define the construct, it's hard to say where it's represented in the brain. So for example, thought is a difficult construct to pin down. In fact, many people wouldn't use that term in psychobiology because it's so vague. A thought can mean something that you're aware of. A thought can be unconscious or conscious, depending on how you define it. It can cover a lot. It can be a very specific thing as well. Similarly, like intelligence, there's a lot of controversy over how intelligence should actually be defined, and a range of other constructs in psychology as well. There are some characteristics of human thought that we have observed. One is that it appears to be mostly verbal. This is very interesting. So one suggestion for why babies and very young children don't form explicit memories is that they don't have language yet, and the way that we actually think in language even if we're not fully aware of it. Language allows us to organize time and ourselves. Kids self-talk a lot when they're young, so you might see a little kid when they're playing. If she's working with her blocks, she might talk to herself and say, stack this block on top of this block. Kids talk to themselves a lot more, which eventually turns into subverting self-talk. So as we get older, we stop talking to ourselves. But a lot of that self-talk is still happening in our thoughts. Borrowing from the field of schizophrenia research, this is actually likely where command hallucinations, which is hallucinations where a voice is telling somebody to do something. This is actually just a misinterpretation of self-talk. Actually, we kind of verbally command ourselves to do things a lot, but we're not aware of it. We're not consciously aware of a lot of our self-talk and how verbal a lot of our thought processes are. Syntax, which we talked about how syntax is innate and it supports this ability to organize our thoughts. The caveat is that we have to learn language in order for our innate syntax to emerge and help us organize our thoughts. So if someone did not learn language by the critical period by around 6 years old, they won't have that innate syntax emerging, and they won't be able to organize their thoughts based on language. Another characteristic of human thought is that the human brain wants to make meaning out of its surroundings. It's constantly trying to make meaning. One kind of consequence of this may be this deja vu, which is this feeling that you've done or heard something before, but you can't quite place it. And this actually might be an example of kind of spurious attempts of the brain to create connections. Our brain is always trying to create connections, so you might occasionally have this feeling of having experienced an exact moment previously. And thinking is likely interaction, however we define it. It's probably interactions between many different brain systems. There's no one thinking region of the brain. Association cortices are something we didn't get to talk a lot about. They were mentioned kind of briefly in several chapters, especially the sensory chapters. But these are neocortices outside of the primary sensory and motor areas. So there's the motor association cortex and the sensory association cortex, visual association, etc. Input to the association cortices comes from parts of the thalamus that also receive information from other cortical areas. So association cortices may be integrating sensory information with higher level information, other cortical areas. In addition, we didn't get to talk much about the anterior cingulate cortex, which is this pretty interesting medial part of the cortex. Some people consider it part of the frontal lobe, some people don't. But it has a connection, creates connections between emotional systems and cognition, and has a lot of interesting functions that we don't have time to get into right now. But it does seem to be another area that kind of creates a connection between other functions. Multisensory integration is another interesting area that we didn't get to talk about. So our brain integrates information from different areas really quickly and effectively, to the extent that we don't really know how to explain it, and this is called the binding problem, explaining how our brain is able to integrate information so quickly and effectively. We understand a lot of the more basic processing better, but we don't understand the really higher order processing. Possibly multimodal regions of association cortices could be involved in multisensory integration and the binding problem. Multimodal regions integrate information from more than one sensory modality, so integrating information from visual and auditory systems, for example. We don't have a good map of this in the brain, but there's this image from a monkey brain of some areas where it's been noted that more than one sensory modality is being processed in that area, at least sometimes. Many of you might have heard of synesthesia. Some people are synesthesiacs, which means that when one sensory modality is stimulated, it automatically stimulates another. So I think one of the more common ones is grapheme color synesthesia, in which an individual, if they see a letter, specific letters and specific numbers each have their own color. So S's in this example are always this fuchsia color, A's are always this dark red, numbers are like the 1 is always a teal color, for example, and it's kind of like automatically processed this way. There's indication that this may result because of cross-activation of the color and grapheme areas in the brain. They're pretty close to each other, grapheme being symbols like numbers and letters. They're close together, and so in some people's brain, these may get activated at the same time. There's a number of types of synesthesia, and it's really interesting. I recommend reading more about it or checking out YouTube videos about people who have it if you're interested. But there's another type called mirror touch synesthesia, where a person feels sensation that they observe in another person. And this is might be related to empathy, but it more typically occurs in people who have other types of synesthesia as well. Attention is a cognitive function we also did not get to talk about. Attention is when the focus of awareness is the ability to focus awareness to internal or external stimuli. So you can focus your attention inward to try to get a memory, to try to think about something, to try to plan or decide. You can also focus attention externally to something in your environment, if you want to focus on your computer screen, for example. It can be influenced by factors in the environment as well as internal influences. So in our environment, there are certain things that naturally catch our attention. If there's movement in our environment, in an otherwise still environment, this automatically catches our attention. Novel stimuli, things we don't recognize. If we're sitting in a classroom and been sitting in the classroom with the same people every week, and there's a new person suddenly, this person is more likely to attract our attention, kind of naturally and almost against our will. Internal motivation is another way of internally allocating attention. So if we have an internal motivation, if there's a book we really, really want to read, this is kind of like an intrinsic motivation to focus our attention on the book. To the right, these dot pictures, this is just an example of how certain novel stimuli are likely, or novel meaning like new or different stimuli, are more likely to attract our attention. So in the image where it's all green and there's one red dot, you can't help but look at the dot. It's almost impossible to ignore that dot. Whereas in the right panel, where there's many different colors, you actually kind of have to try to find the red dot because there's many novel stimuli, or it's not that different. And this is called the pop-out effect. When there's one thing that's quite different, it grabs our attention. Attention has pretty complex neural underpinnings. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as well as frontal eye fields, which are just a little bit anterior to the DLPFC, are implicated in attention, but a number of other brain areas are as well. Ultimately, stimuli are fighting for our attention, so stimuli in the environment and also internal stimuli are constantly engaged in a competition to be present in our conscious awareness. Okay, so moving on to section 3, expanding the frontiers of cognitive neuroscience. I didn't include most of the information from this section, but I thought social neuroscience is very interesting. And this is the study, of course, of social functions and social phenomena in the brain. Theory of mind is a theory I mentioned in a previous lecture. So it's the ability to attribute mental states to other people. People with autism tend to be poor at this. They're not able to guess what another person is thinking, and difficult to understand complex social interactions. And there are specific neural areas that are associated in theory of mind. One is the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Another is the temporal lobe, temporal pole, and then another part of the temporal sulcus. The sense of self, or understanding of oneself, is also, of course, represented in the brain. There are many areas of the brain that code for different types of sense of self, because there's actually many components of having a sense of self. There's a physical sense of self, sense of owning your body, sense of controlling your own actions. It's actually a really complex construct. But some of the main areas in the brain that have been associated are represented by these colored rectangles in the midline structures of this brain. So some frontal regions and then parietal regions as well. And then finally, there's this one area of the brain in this represented in this spinning brain, the little red dot, is out-of-body experiences are in the temporal parietal junction. So this is the connection between feeling like you're embodied within your body. So out-of-body experience is something people sometimes have when they're on the verge of dying, or it can actually be stimulated. It can be stimulated by TMSing the temporoparietal junction, but it feels, some people have felt that they're in an out-of-body experience. It feels like your soul, for lack of a better word, is exiting your body. It feels like you no longer inhabit your body. And that is a rather specific area of the brain. Okay, so the last section of the class is consciousness, and this is really complex. The neural substrates of consciousness and the neural underpinnings of consciousness are, it's one of the most complex areas of neuroscience in general. And but part of this is because consciousness itself is a very complex construct. It's been defined in many different ways. Your book defines it as the mind's level of responsiveness to impressions made by the senses, and I think this is a very neuroscience-based definition of consciousness. Other people define it as the ability to think derived from the ability to feel, or the awareness of one's own existence. Some people say it's whatever, take animal cognition and subtract from human cognition, and whatever's left over is consciousness. Notably, many people in psychology don't like the term consciousness and don't believe that it's a meaningful term or a meaningful construct. People have told me that it's a 4-letter word in psychology. But there are scientists who have attempted to study consciousness in the brain and have come up with some pretty interesting results. So this individual, Christoph Koch, he's one of the most well-known researchers of consciousness, and he's a really unusual guy with an affinity for pink. He had his hair dyed pink for some reason for a really long time, and he forces his lab to wear these unusual red vests because he's obsessed with color, but he's all over just a really unusual guy. But I recommend, if you're interested in the neurobiology of consciousness, I recommend looking up. I'm sure he has TED Talks. But Christoph Koch has studied the neurobiology of consciousness throughout his entire career, and he believes that there's this area called the colostrum, which is the most likely candidate for as a neural substrate of unified experience and the regulation of consciousness and cognition. He believes that it might use synchronized neural oscillatory activity to unify brain areas. So neural oscillatory activity is when lots of neurons fire together, and this can happen across a range of brain regions, and they fire together just like in sleep waves. We talked about oscillatory activity, the alpha waves and the beta waves, things like that. So fire together, and this may be a way of sort of unifying areas, activating areas of the brain simultaneously. There's also, as I mentioned in the optional readings for this section, there's a recent article by Christoph Koch's group where they recently found neurons in the mouse brain that are encircling the entire brain. So it's really, for the central nervous system, a really long neuron. So for interneurons, it's a really long neuron, and appears to have connections within quite a lot of different areas of the brain. And Christoph Koch's group thinks this may be somehow related to consciousness and with unifying different areas and functions of the brain.